Good morning. 50% of the character and integrity of a printed page lies in its letter forms. Much of the other 50% resides in its margins. Now, letter forms we get. Comic Sans is different than Helvetica, is different than Times New Roman. That's easy. But margins I love. Margins are the parts of the page felt, but often unnoticed. They disappear. And margins become this sort of metaphor for the parts of the apps and software and hardware that we produce that is easily overlooked, undernoticed, or outright dismissed. One of my favorite scenes in a movie of the last couple of years was from this Japanese film, 2013, called Fune o Amu, or The Great Passage in English. And ostensibly, it's a film about this man and woman falling in love, but really, it's a movie about making a dictionary. Truly, it's a movie about this group of folks spending 15 years making a dictionary. And now, the protagonist of the film, we'll call him Dictionary Man, loves books. He lives books, he breathes books, he is books. He sleeps in this room on that little nook on the floor in between all those books. And so 14 years into the process of making this dictionary, finally they start to think about what the physical shape is going to be, what the container is going to look like. And a paper man arrives in the office. And he says, "Dictionary man, I've got the best paper you've ever seen." He said, 5 microns thick, no bleed through at all. He said, "You make a dictionary with this paper, it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be the best dictionary in the world." And Dictionary Man's looking at Paper Man's samples. He's touching them. And he lets this noise out of sort of disapproval. He says, "Paper Man, come here. I want to show you something." And he grabs off the counter an old dictionary. He says, "Paper Man, check this out, all right? The main core part of usability of a dictionary is something that we call page curl feel." He said, "This is it. This is the end-all, be-all of dictionaries, page curl feel." And he's flicking through a bunch of pages. He says, "Look, Paper Man, the best dictionary paper sticks to the fingers, but not the other pages." He said, "Check it out. Come here, give it a touch, Paper Man." Paper Man reaches over and he flicks through a few pages. And he lets out a noise as if the very matrix of life in paper itself had been unzipped. And he finally, for the first time ever, realizes what great dictionary paper feels like. And he bows his head, and he apologizes, and he says, "We will try harder." Now, I saw this movie on airplane. I started crying during this scene. But it's the parts of the things we build that are felt but often unnoticed. Medium is a publishing, reading, and writing platform. Ev Williams is going to speak to it later today. Fundamentally, it lets you make pages that kind of look like this. Really simple, beautiful, full bleed photography, clean typography. You open this page on any device in the world, and it's going to look great. That's the promise of Medium. And I'm an advisor at the company, and I see how the sausage is made, and they're working so hard to make this as accessible and simple as possible. And now, if you're making a writing platform, you're implicitly making an editing platform as well, because writing is, if nothing else, rewriting. And as a writer, I find I can't edit anything longer than 500 words unless I print it out. And now, this is a weird thing to bring up and to point out here, but one of the great joys of using Medium, of which there are many, but one of the great true joys of using Medium is the fact that the print styles are so pretty. If you hit print on a Medium page, the thing that comes out of your printer is one full of love and respect and care. The margins are great, the font sizes are just right, the background images print as they should, links are styled as they should. It's an incredibly weird thing to think about on the web, that printing would be important. But in this context, if you're making writing software, you must be making editing software as well. And you must acknowledge the fact that printing is a part of that process. And they do. Here's another page on Medium. Looks simple enough. But if we zoom in and we focus, we see there's a little bit of hanging punctuation. And now this theoretically should be really easy because CSS has a hanging punctuation property, but no one's really implemented it. And so at Medium, they're doing this with JavaScript and CSS. And it's very unlikely that most people notice this. But there are these small bits of marginal beauty throughout all of Medium. M dashes are hairline spaced on either side, not full spaced or not without no space. And you have to believe that all of these small details collude. They come together to form a texture of experience and delight. That even if nobody notices any of these details, you must believe, as a designer, as an engineer, as CEO, you must believe that this is going to be felt. My favorite part of the latest iPhone 6 is this edge right here, or the other edge. What do we do on an iPhone? We tap and we swipe. And of all the swipes we do, one of the most important swipes is the back swipe, from the edge of the device in. And the thing I love about the iPhone 6, more than any of its fancy details, the new camera, the Touch ID, I love the fact that the hardware for the first time has an affordance that connects directly with the software. That if you pick up an iPhone 6, I guarantee you most people have rubbed their finger over that edge, moving into the device, because it feels so good. And for the first time, this action, this piece of UI that was really undiscoverable before, where we used to have to reach into the far left-hand corner to go backwards in the app, is now there, and it's part of the hardware. It's part of the DNA of the hardware, and it's discoverable, and it's full of delight, and it's lovely. George Nakashima is a first-generation Japanese-American born in 1905 in Spokane, Washington. He was trained as an architect, but he became famous for his furniture and his work as a craftsman. This is one of his more famous chairs called the Konoid chair. In fact, he was so good at melding Japanese craftsmanship with American modernism that in 1983 he was awarded the Order of Sacred Treasure by the Japanese emperor. Now, unfortunately, George passed away in 1990, but there was an interview with him beforehand, and he talks a little bit about his philosophy of how he makes his furniture and why he does it, and I want to share that with you today.
I feel that there's a spirit in trees that's very deep, and I'm somewhat of a druid that way. I especially when it comes to something extraordinary, I find the spirit just bouncing up and down in the grain of a tree. So there is that relationship. I have essentially no interest in furniture as such. I mean, I would find it impossible to try to design a chair out of plastic or metal or plywood. I'm not in that kind of spirit. But I do feel that in order to produce a fine piece of furniture, the spirit of a tree lives on. And I can give it a second life. It's something like the medical profession. But I think this is, in a way, even more realistic and deeper than what the medical profession can do, because I can make an object that lives and can live forever, possibly, if used properly. So that's my objective, and that's my happiness, is to find this relationship with a tree.
I love this idea of make an object that lives forever. I've had the opportunity over the years to engage with or sit in or touch George's work, some of his chairs and his tables, and there was always something about it that I couldn't put my finger on that made them special. And then I found this interview a couple months ago, and I realized this crazy philosophy of building for infinity. And also listening to him say that his work is more important than the medical profession, things like that. That's sort of that level of intensity of craft and creation. I realized that was what I was feeling whenever I encountered his work, even if I didn't know how to say it or notice it. Facebook Paper is one of my favorite apps that's come out in the last couple of years. It's a reimagining of the Facebook news feed through an updated interface. The team was led by Mike Mattis, who was also one of the co-founders of Push Pop Press. They produced one of the, still to this day, I think one of the best digital standalone books, Our Choice for Al Gore, back a few years ago. But the thing about Facebook Paper that is so compelling is that when you install it on your phone, it feels as if a certain kind of alien technology has landed on the device. It's so tactile, so much more tactile than any other consumer product I had used up until that point. Everything is an object in the app. You can touch and play with and manipulate all the pieces of this app, and it responds to one finger or two fingers or three fingers. And what happens is all of this responsiveness and tactility comes together to form this fully formed universe. And the interesting corollary to that is that there are no hard edges in the app. And what I mean by that is if you're in an app and you're not allowed to go in a certain direction, usually just nothing happens. You swipe and you bump against a wall. But in Facebook Paper, because everything is an object and everything has a certain physics property attributed to it, even if you try to go into a direction that you're not supposed to, instead of not responding at all, it gently responds. It's gently. Always a gentle response. And it's the difference between putting up on a wall or in a hallway, "Do not enter" in big, bold letters, versus "Please don't go in this direction." And writ over hundreds or thousands of missed interactions or trying to go the wrong way, that conspires to create this beautiful interface, this beautiful experience that you have to believe is felt, even if users don't explicitly notice it. And this idea, make an app that lives forever. I mean, this is preposterous today. No app in and of itself is an island. All of our apps are dependent on so many third-party libraries, so many third-party distribution vectors. The idea of version 1.1 of an app lasting more than a week or a month or a year is almost absurd to think about. Things are updated so frequently. But what about the philosophies of an app? What is Facebook Paper? It's first and foremost an app, yes. But more than that, it's a philosophy about how interfaces on these tactile devices should function, and really how the entire phone should function, to be honest. And so what happens if you take that philosophy and you give that to the world to incorporate into their own work? Well, Facebook's done that. They open sourced the physics library behind Facebook Paper and called it POP. And anyone can install this. And it kind of points back to the best of open source. Things like Dennis Ritchie's original C libraries, the core C libraries, are still present in the computers that we use today that have been sort of brought decades forward into the future. And that, yes, no user directly touches Dennis Ritchie's C libraries, but the software that's built atop them is influenced by the philosophies and the decisions Dennis made. And you have to believe that those decisions are felt in the software that we use today. Richard Serra is an American sculptor who always has this sort of intense look on his face. Right around the corner from here, actually, the SF MoMA, there's a piece of his in the permanent installation called Night Shift. And he took 15,000 pounds of lead, melted it down, and threw it against the corner of this room. Let it dry, pried it off with crowbars, dragged it across the room, did that over and over and over again. Here's an image of a work of his called Sequence being installed at the New York City MoMA in 2007. This is for his retrospective. And I went to this show. I arrived a couple days before it ended, and I was flying back to Tokyo the next day. And so this was my last chance to see this work. And I arrived at the MoMA at 5:15. I didn't know that the MoMA closed at 5:30. So I had to either pay $25 to get to spend 15 minutes with his work or pay nothing and leave. So of course I paid. And two interesting things happened. One, because it was a weekday and it was so close to the closing of the MoMA, no one was in the gallery. So I went to the second floor directly to Sequence. Nobody was there. And then number two, none of the guards and none of the workers asked me to leave until 6 o'clock. So I had a 45-minute private showing with Richard's work. And it was good that I was alone because I started to walk through this structure in between these walls, and tears started to flow down my face. And now, if you'd asked me before if I was going to cry when I walked into this thing, I would have said no, obviously not. But there was something about the curves, there's something about the shifting aperture above and below and in front of you as you walked through this space, and the way the air bounced off the walls, and the way that the sound of your footsteps echoed off these weatherproof steel walls, that you began to feel this incredible emotion that Richard had put into this work, and you began to feel all of the work that had gone into getting this piece to this very spot on that very day. And I love thinking about Richard's work in the context of George's and the Dictionary Man. I mean, the Dictionary Man, here he is trying to take all of the ineffability of language, which is so human in its construct, and give it some sort of human form, this untouchable, intangible thing, give it a weird form, put edges on it. It's a big form, but it sits on your desk, all of human language sitting on your desk. And then George Nakashima taking these huge organic structures that we have a little bit of intimacy with, but not much, and then giving them another life after they pass away on a scale that is intensely human. And then here's Richard working with the most inhuman of materials, weatherproof steel. And yet, by extruding it and creating these curves and iterating on it, he's able to produce some kind of emotion that's totally unexpected. And I love thinking about that. And coming back to reality, away from these sort of weird, towering art universes, in the most recent iPad release, Apple talks about this 0.6 millimeters, this shaving of 0.6 millimeters. And now we forget sometimes that the original iPad was so cumbersome. I mean, this was a heavy device. It was thick. The screen was only 132 ppi. It really wasn't that great to read on. You held it in one hand, and after a minute, your wrist was hurting. It constantly made itself present. But you take 0.6 millimeters, which doesn't sound like much, and you wonder, why obsess over that? Why obsess over shaving these small bits off of this device? And writ over 4 years, you end up with something that looks like this. And what we're getting close to here is just a piece of glass with a little bit of battery behind it. And now the glass alone is without emotion, without humanity. But the beautiful thing about this is that this device now doesn't draw attention to itself when you're using it. And for the first time in years, we have a true tablet. And I'm reticent to bring up so many Apple products, but the reality is if you're building publishing platforms for tablets, you're really building for this tablet. And for the first time ever, the content is a true first-class citizen. And that as you use this device, it disappears, and you get fully immersed in the emotion of what's on the device. Smart News is a Japanese startup that I became an advisor for about 6 months ago. The easiest way to explain it is Google News in a really efficient iPhone app. It's the #1 news reader in Japan, has over 5 million users, just raised $36 million to launch around the world. And this is what the app looked like when I joined. No margins really anywhere, and no hierarchy either. And so the first thing we set out to do was to create a hierarchy and to add margins, literal margins, to the app, and this is where we ended up a few months later. And now, from this to this, the data sources were all the same. The data was great. That's why it was so loved in Japan. And all we were doing was taking away margins or adding margins, adding a little bit of hierarchy and changing the font a little bit to emphasize that hierarchy. I bring up this example just because of all the things I'm talking about today, this is most explicitly focused on pure margins. This is what the reading interface in the so-called Smart View looks like on an iPhone 5, on an iPhone 6, on an iPhone 6 Plus, an iPad mini. These changes are 1 pixel or 2 pixels or 3 pixels. And now, no one who opens the app on an iPhone 6 Plus and looks at it is going to think to themselves, well, great, they added 2 pixels of margin as opposed to the iPhone 6. But you have to believe that they're going to feel it, spending hours a day reading in the app. And so we're at this point now where the hardware is sort of disappearing. It's becoming more lovely, and it's sort of disappearing. And software has the ability to be more tactile than it's ever been before. And this is exciting for publishing and reading and writing, because finally it feels like we're getting closer to achieving some of that tactility and emotion that's so inherently present in paper. 50% of the character and integrity of a printed page lies in its letter forms. Much of the other 50% resides in its margins, says Robert Bringhurst, poet and typographer. We will try harder, says the paperman. Make an object that lives forever, says George Nakashima. Thank you.
One of the ideas that Craig touched on is